Hey, good people, and welcome to another episode of The Flow. And you know the tagline already. To go with the flow, we need to understand the flow, and there's so much going on. The flow is, I can't say that it's like floating down La La through a nice soft river. We're kind of in Whitewater, and we need to pay attention. And one of the things that happens in Whitewater is that, sometimes we can kind of get overwhelmed by it. And so today's guest, David Beckmeyer, is a retired Silicon Valley tech freak guru who retired and then took a look at the same whitewater that the rest of us are going in. And being the kind of person, the inquisitive, curious kind of guy he is and kind of tech oriented, he wanted to know more about it. So he took the deep dive. He's the one that went in and said, what's going on here? How does it happen? What do the psychologists say? What do the psychiatrists say? What do the social scientists say? And then how can I spread that word around and give people some idea about how we can navigate the whitewater? And so, David Beckemeyer, please say hi to the folks and tell us a little bit about the flow of your life.
Well, hi, everybody. And hey, Bob, thanks for having me on the show. Yeah, that was great. I think that you captured better than I do. Can I steal all that?
Yeah, you can. Sure.
um, yeah. So, yeah, I guess the flow of my life is, like I said, spent a lot of years in tech and retired from that. Kind of got a little burnout by that world, by the way. Kind of just found myself, like everybody else, struggling kind of navigate some of these political dynamic with 2016 elections. 2016 elections were kind of riled people up, and then sort of another round of that when we had sort of COVID and the lockdowns and lots of people unfriending each other and all that. So that was part of my life and I was involved in it. And so then I wanted to just understand this better. Like, this doesn't seem good.
You made me think of something with that right now, and it's something I think most of us forget, that, the current situation that we have right now came on the heels of that very upsetting COVID time. It's almost as if we really didn't have time to take a breath between, the COVID upset and then the chaos of today's. Do you see those two things having a connection?
Well, I think the situation we're in now is definitely an accumulation. Like, there isn't one thing; it's kind of been building. But those events, I think, are all catalysts. I think the 2016 election kind of heated things up and accelerated things, accelerant of types. And then I think COVID also exacerbated a lot of those tensions and got drew on some of those same emotions and pulled us apart even more. Yeah, and then that has just continued to sort of spiral in that direction since then. And yeah, I think the COVID piece of it and the whole pandemic, and I think we haven't really done a good reflection on that, and we haven't really healed from it. And it's one of those, Americans are really good at sort of just shoving things under the carpet, right?
Mhm.
We don't like to face, kind of these difficult things or even admit we were scared. And I think that's a big piece of where we are now. We fully haven't healed even from that.
Yeah, no, it's kind of, I think we understand it in our own relationships, with our partners, with our spouses. We go through these times when we're very loving and everything's great. Then we go through these very difficult times and we just don't want to be in them. So we kind of like put a little band-aid on it and shove it under the carpet. And it's not like it goes away and it kind of resurfaces. And like you say, maybe we should be taking more time to reflect and think about some of those things. So, how do you see where we are today? You have a podcast called Outrage Overload. So think about the name of that podcast, Outrage Overload, and tell me that's not something that we kind of feel all the time. So you have a podcast where you talk to people about that, and you get different insights and reflections on how people see that. Where does that? How does that come up for you now? If I say outrage overload, how do you define it?
Yeah, I mean, so as I went into this, I'm not a social scientist. I'm not even really an academic. And I'm not a journalist either. So, like, what qualities am I bringing to this, right? But I'm an inquisitive person. But I didn't know a lot of the lingo. I didn't know a lot of the jargon. and I didn't know there was such a thing as sort of a bridge building movement. I hadn't heard the term like depolarization and this kind of stuff. So I didn't know any of that movement. So the thing that stood out for me is this idea of outrage, kind of as sort of an umbrella term for lots of these emotions, fear and anger and moral indignation of being some of the biggest ones. And, and then the overload side of it is that we're just sort of inundated with this, right? Like outrage as an emotion is sort of got value. We can sort of we can be together and we can sort of see something happen. We can kind of get outraged about it together and we can maybe do something about it. But if we're sort of always dialed up to 11, that whole mechanism doesn't really work and it's not good for our mental health and everything else. So that's where, as sort of a layman, I just that kind of captured the state for me. Like we're just sort of being bombarded with outrage, whether you're wherever you are in the political spectrum. There's lots of people telling you how awful things are, how awful the other side is, all the bad things that are going on, and you're just getting more and more outraged about all the things the other side is doing, and then that's just builds and keeps us at this agitated state all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember a teacher of mine was talking about stress, and he says everybody says that stress is a bad thing, but it's not really a bad thing because it's what motivates us to get stuff done. It's when we get stressed out that it's not so great, and that when we get overloaded, overwhelmed. So that's kind of like what you're talking about, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
And you have any idea? I mean, what does that do for our ability to, make wiser thoughts? Not wiser thoughts, but wiser choices, and to be able to look at things um, openly.
Yeah, exactly. So when all those emotions start flooding in, then the sort of critical thinking part of our brain kind of shuts off. And so those critical thinking processes are much harder to do when we're stressed out and fearful and angry. And it does mean that we're often not doing a lot of critical thinking, right? We're kind of acting on tribal instincts are some of the strongest instincts that we're acting on, and other emotions. And again, most of the sort of really challenging part is all this is kind of going on without you really knowing. You're not really that conscious that all this is happening. We always see ourselves as a rational observer making the right decisions. That's what our brain tells us all the time, right? But that's not necessarily the
Especially
reality.
when we're angry. Especially when we're angry.
Right, right. Especially when we're angry, upset, and fearful, right? So that's a part of the big challenges that our more critical uh, thinking part of our brain kind of gets shut off, gets overwhelmed again. Use that gets overwhelmed, gets overloaded, and gets kind of pushed to the side by these other parts, other sort of mechanisms for thinking. And so, yeah, that's a big piece of it. Is if you can reclaim that calmness a little bit and turn some of those parts of our brain off, that can allow you to look at things a little more broadly, clearly, and make some of those better decisions. And like I said, I'm not like some magic person that has this all figured out and I always get it right. But at least by talking to all these scientists and different research, we know that this is true. Now, how to do it in real life is still can be a challenge.
Yeah, it seems as though that moment when you become overwhelmed, when you don't see any other solutions except I got to stop this, is the time when we should tone it down. But it seems like that's also the very time when it's the hardest to tone it down.
Right, exactly. I mean, if we can get better at being mindful of those things happening. Like I'm kind of feeling my blood pressure going up. I'm kind of feeling this tension. I'm kind of feeling a little agitated. I want to respond. Those are great indicators to say, maybe there's more to this. Maybe I need to think about it some more. Maybe I need to look at some more data or even just walk away for a bit and look at something else or take a deep dive on something. All those are ways of sort of stepping away and turning some of that down. But as you say, in the moment, that's the hardest time to do it because we really feel compelled to respond or react to this.
um, I think I have a metaphor forming in my mind right now. I'm thinking of a metaphor of weights, like barbells or dumbbells. Yeah, you don't start with a 50-pound dumbbell, it's a 10-pound dumbbell. So if you're going to deal with building up the ability to do that, what is the 5-pound dumbbell to start with? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great analogy. I mean, in this sort of space, we talk about building, or in one of the sort of missions we talk about with outrage overload is kind of this idea of building civic muscle. Like that's what we say.
Mhm.
Right. And that comes in a lot of different forms. But yeah, it's a great question. I like this question a lot. Like I like the analogy and I like the question because you're right. A lot of times when people are sort of talking about someone saying, oh, you should have a dialogue with people on the other side or something like that. And what we think of in our mind, we immediately think of like the most extreme person we know. Like it's just, and we want to start there. Like we're going to jump right in the deep end and take on Uncle Bob, who's like a real challenge.
Yeah,
And
I'm
yeah,
gonna
that's
go on
probably
a
not.
diet. I think I need to go on a diet, so I'm gonna fast.
Right, right. Which that works for a day, right? Like,
Right.
yeah, right,
So go ahead,
exactly.
MG.
So, yeah, diving into that, the most challenging person is not probably not the best approach. I mean, if you can think of somebody that's a little more adjacent, like someone you know pretty well, you sort of like them, but they have there's a few places where they differ. Their opinions differ on things. Like that's a good place to start. And there are a lot of organizations you can sort of do you can do this online, you can do it in person with organizations like Crossing Party Lines, where they hold conversations, and you can begin building some of these conversation skills, and you can be more of a lurker there. Just kind of watch how other people do it too. So they'll have a topic, whatever that topic might be. You can participate, and it has a moderator. I'm a trained moderator, certified moderator with Crossing Party Lines, so I moderate some of these conversations. And the moderator's role is mostly just making sure everybody has a turn to speak, making sure it doesn't start turning into people all shouting at each other, and stay on topic, that kind of thing. So moderator's role is pretty light touch, generally, unless somebody's really misbehaving. But so it's mostly about everybody getting a chance to speak, other people, and share their view, and then other people kind of either responding to that or just sharing their own view. They don't have to respond, and that helps you build some of this muscle of just kind of staying in the room when people say things that you're not used to hearing. Like if, most of the time these days we kind of hang out in our bubble of folks that kind of see the world similarly. And when politics come up, it kind of becomes more of a cheerleading session where we're kind of all on the same page and we're all sort of cheering about the same things or jeering about the same things, we're complaining about the same things, and we're all in agreement. But in these dialogues where you might have some people with opposing or different views, they might come out with something that, wow, that's something, wow, that makes me really uncomfortable. They're saying the thing that I don't support at all. And then sort of staying in the room for it and not necessarily reacting, but being there, trying to hear it and trying to listen and see how it impacts you. So that's a good place to start, is somebody that's a little more adjacent. Like they're not someone you already know is just way out there and really far away, but maybe they have a few views that are different. And you can
Mhm.
work up to it too, right? You don't necessarily just walk over to them and say, hey, let's talk about politics, right? You might, begin a little, depending on how that relationship looks already, building some rapport and say, hey, would you be open to, I know there's some views I think that maybe we don't completely share about. Would you be open to having a conversation about that? And start with the listening side, right? So give them an opportunity to tell their, as try to be um, imbalanced at first, right? Take on the burden of being the listener more, and then earning the opportunity to say, "Hey, I've been listening to you for quite a while. Talk about that issue. Would it be okay if I shared some of my perspective on this issue?" And so, one thing about this is practice. It takes practice. It takes building those muscles, like you're talking about with the weights, right? You don't take one workshop somewhere and you're now an expert in this. You need to do it, and you can read all the books you want on it. You can, you know, like I say, watch webinars forever, but participating in conversation is how you get better at it. And the biggest challenge is staying in the room when people are saying things that are not expected, like they'll catch you off guard. And we have to remember that we're living in an environment where our information circles or information silos are quite different. So they're going to
Mhm.
talk about things you probably haven't even heard about because it hasn't crossed the information networks that you're in. So they'll bring up something that's going to maybe really catch you off guard. Like I don't even know what you're talking about on this thing. And sometimes maybe that's the best answer you have. It's like, I don't know about that thing. I'm going to have to look into it more.
Mhm. Recently somebody turned me on to a news source called The Ground. Now, I'm not trying to make any pitch for it, but I subscribe to it, and I have found it to be Just fascinating. They cover world news and hundreds of headlines and topics, but at the bottom of each of them, they have a little bar. And one color over here, the red color, is how many left-leaning media sources covered this, how many centrist media sources covered this, and how many left-leaning media sources covered this. Now, I certainly don't read all the news from all over the world, but I do run down those. And, I am surprised at finding how many blind spots there actually are of things that have happened, and one side or the other doesn't even know that they happened. you know um and I just found that to be interesting in and of itself, and kind of opened me up to the idea that maybe surprise surprise, maybe I don't know everything.
Right. Yeah, that could be a little destabilizing to start to realize that your information bubble isn't necessarily always, like you say, got all the stories or maybe even got all the facts, right?
Yeah. But I want to ask another question about that, because be a little bit challenging, because I have tried to get involved with some of these Speaking to America and some of these other groups, and have tried to get off the ground and ultimately failed, because it seemed like there was just lots and lots of left-wing folks who were willing to participate, but there were not a lot of right-wing perspectives that wanted to participate in the conversation, and so they failed. Uh, which leads me to believe that maybe this idea of equality, or what do they call it? Uh, that things are the same on both sides. Both sides are extreme, whatever. There is a difference in how the two sides approach information. It seems to me, just based on that. What do you think?
Yeah, I mentioned the bridge building term, and there's sort of this movement of there's a whole bunch of organizations that are sort of in this bridge building movement and the depolarization space. Yeah, and it's an ongoing challenge and it's an ongoing discussion of that. One thing that attracts, that it's just a natural sort of thing coming out of social sciences. A lot of folks come out of the social sciences. That tends to be, a left leaning or blue leaning segment. And so while well-meaning, a lot of these groups, can appear and come across, while they want to have more participation, I'm not saying they are promoting like a left-leaning message, but they themselves sort of come out of that world. And so they can often come across, there's a lot of left-coded language sometimes. There can just be sometimes, people on the right you'll talk to can sort of say, well, they're just trying to get me to be more, think like someone on the left. Or it's all a big trick to trick me to become more like them. And that's a real challenge, right? You have to show people that you have some credibility, and all the organizations that are in that space are definitely trying to do that, but it is a challenge. And I think like I was saying about crossing party lines, the nice thing about like that organization is it gives you opportunity to keep practicing. You can just keep coming back to different conversations. But yeah, it's even a challenge within that group, right? Like their membership is, 60% or maybe more leaning blue, but there'll always be some counter perspectives in the conversations themselves. There's always at least some. But yeah, it's a challenge in this whole space. And it's a challenge across a lot of these disciplines. Of figuring out the right messaging, and it even goes beyond messaging, but making sure you have participation. If you look at, some of these organizations like the Dignity Index, which is interesting, they kind of just rate speech on a contempt versus respect scale. And that group has tried really hard to they have a mandate to have like an equal board, like there's people on the left and right in their leadership throughout the organization. And so a lot of people are trying to come at this problem in different ways. But yeah, it is a problem. Now, are there fundamental differences sort of between people on the right and left? Maybe. Like I said, I think with what I've seen with people on the right, sometimes they're just suspicious that it's kind of a plot by people on the left to get them to become more like people on the left. And that's a sense, sort of a sense they get from it, even if I don't think that's true, but I could certainly see how it could come across that way. And all these groups are a little bit self-selecting too, right? So when you have one dialogues, everybody has self-selected to say, I care about having better dialogue. So right there, you're getting a subset of the population that has shown enough curiosity in that they're going to participate. So you're not necessarily getting, the most divisive people. Always, sometimes there's some pretty divisive people come in, but somebody that has said, "Hey, I think there's an issue, and I want to get better at having these conversations." Some people do come into these things thinking, "Well, this is my way to get my message across and convince everyone that I've got the right view." And usually those people can be managed, with moderation and stuff. And when I say managed, I just mean if you follow the rules, that's fine. You can still present all those strong views as long as you still follow the rules and don't dominate the conversation and get angry, get sort of one-on-one insults and things like that. Sure, come in and try to present those views. If you think that's the model that's going to get everyone, to get everyone to think like you, that's fine. Because even in that, you're learning the practice of better dialogue.
So I'm going to ask you to name that organization again, and we'll probably say the name a few times because if people are as old as I am, remembering names is sometimes hard. So where do you think is a great place to start this process?
It's an organization you can find online and you can participate online. So you don't have to, it doesn't have to, it's not just in your local neighborhood. You can
Right?
participate on these conversations or across the world. And it's called Crossing Party Lines.
Crossing party lines. Everybody got that? Crossing party lines.
And it's
And
only
you
one of
and
many, but it's one I'm
it,
associated with.
but it's one that you're associated with, and it's one that you find is at least doing everything it can to be legitimate. I
Oh
mean, we
yeah.
have
And
to
what
get
I like about I think how they stand out the most is they see this as a long-term process. And so it takes practice. Whereas some of the other organizations, I won't name them, kind of have a workshop and people leave the workshop and think now they're the ones who are going to tell everybody else how to do this. But they only had one
uh,
workshop.
right, right. I can't help but think about one of the things that the brain scientists are finding out about fear and relaxation and how that affects the mind. Because as you know, we are more stressed, as we are more angry, our right side brain, which is more involved with survival, and our amygdala and the primitive responses to threats, causes us to narrow and constrict the focus of our attention, because what we're looking for and what we need in order to relieve the stress and the danger is an answer. And so we're focused on, resolving the thing, fixing it. If I think I can fix it by beating you up or by convincing you of something or something like that, then I'm going to do it. When we relax, we actually see the world more broadly. And to the extent that even the peripheral vision expands. We literally see the world more broadly. And if you think of this in primitive terms, if I'm out on the hunt for the woolly mammoth, I'm going to be focused on every crack of every twig and every movement in the jungle. Could be a snake, could be a tiger. So I'm focused on what I have to do because my survival's at stake. But then when I go back to the tribe at night and we're sitting around the campfire, that's the time to wonder what the stars are and to tell the stories, about the gods and making up whatever it is that becomes our traditional, our stories, and our creativity all comes out there. And so it does make a lot of sense to me when you say that it is when we are stressed and overwhelmed that we're just focused on doing whatever it is we need to survive. And the last thing we think of is listening to the other person.
Right. Right. And because that's a threat, right? We start hearing things that
Mm.
are destabilizing because it's the stuff we don't normally hear in our circle and that kind of thing. But I do want to point out here that a couple things. I mean, it's important to say that this is not just kind of a kumbaya thing, like we'll all get along. You aren't necessarily doing the other person a favor, to do a lot of this. You're really doing this. You can think of it as a selfish thing, right? Because I'm going to be more effective. I'm going to be less stressed out. That's going to make me more effective. If I am trying to be an advocate for something, I'm not going to be a very good advocate if I don't understand anything about the other side's concerns and issues. I think I do because my side tells me what they're concerned about, but that's not usually right. Those are usually the made up things. What you really want to understand about what are they really concerned about, and that'll help you be a better advocate, and you can also be a better decision maker. So you don't have to think of this as I'm doing somebody else a big favor by listening to them. And also there's another aspect of it too, that by listening to them, I'm somehow agreeing with them. And that's not
Hmm.
necessarily the case, but it's hard to separate that sometimes. Like people think, well, if I let them say the thing, then they're going to think I agree or I'm going to have to agree. Like you don't have to change your mind. Like you can let them tell their whole story. You don't have to change your mind at all. If
Hmm.
you're afraid you're going to change your mind, that might be a different, a different kind of thing that we're dealing with. And I also want to say that like there are legitimate things to be outraged about. So it's like it's okay to be outraged about stuff, but what we're really trying to deal with is just this overwhelm, this outrage overload,
Hmm.
right? You can be more effective about like picking and choosing your battles a little bit, right? About, where should I be focusing that energy rather than just caught up in the daily barrage and I'm mad about everything every day. And it doesn't even let me look at these larger things I care about. Like have that list, be more, um, mindful about it. Maybe write down the 5 things that are like my big concerns that I want to kind of think about and not be distracted by all that other stuff. Like it's
Hmm.
okay to have convictions. It's okay to have issues you want to resolve and even be outraged about it. Maybe there's stuff we should be more outraged about, right? But we're so caught up in everyday other little stuff that really wasn't even on our radar last week. And now it's the biggest thing that we're so concerned about. So I think that's what a lot of this lets you do. If you can find some of that clarity, you can stay focused on those things that are important to you and even just identify what are the things that are important to you. You were talking about all the things you said about the brain science. It's 100% true. There's other aspects of that too, like just having a better understanding of what are my big picture goals and values and concerns. That can also keep you grounded because you can really understand that better. And I keep going back to those things. And am I still consistent with those values and those concerns and that kind of thing? Even having that kind of thing can help. So yeah, you're 100% right that we greatly underestimate how much sort of biofeedback control we have over our own brain. If you can
Hmm.
get that amygdala to calm down, tell it it's okay. We're not getting eaten by the lion right now. It's all right. We can work this out, or we can start engaging with this kind of stuff, right? And you have to really convince your brain it's okay. We're okay.
Yeah. Back in the day, one of the most popular self-help books that was out there, and it was taken up by the business community, hand over foot. But I still go back to it, throughout my life. Stephen Covey's the 7 Habits of Highly Efficient People. He didn't say effective; he said efficient. And he said, maybe he said effective.
I think you
I
said
can't
effective,
remember.
but yeah.
Effective. And one of those is first seek to understand and then seek to be understood. And, I'll be a little bit confessional right now. Over the past couple of days, I was getting into one of those little situations with my wife where I was started collecting stamps. Oh, she did that. I put that in my stamp book, and I'm waiting to get up enough stamps in my stamp book so I can come back with some really good, piss offedness. And yeah, I confess, I confess. And so finally, I collected enough stamps and I came back and I was really all self righteous and everything else. And I couldn't get anywhere. And then we went to sleep and got up the next day. And she said, "There's a couple of things I want to tell you." And by now I had calmed down a little bit. So I sat and I listened and I let her go all the way through her things. And when she was done, the next thing she says, "So what can I do for you?" And that's just how people are. You want to be heard and you want to be understood. And once you get your say out, you're ready to be receptive. And I was ready to be receptive after I got my say out. And then fortunately, I was able to remind myself to listen to her and let her get her say out. And that was all that was really necessary. I mean, because ultimately we love each other and we wanted to get back to that, state. We both wanted to get there. But we had some things that, needed to be said. And it's just amazing. I mean, I could tell you so many stories as a lawyer how many times I had very difficult clients who, after I just sat and listened to their story, and let them get it all out and repeated it back to them to make sure that I understood it, and they felt heard, they felt understood, how at that point they were open to different ways that we might go about resolving their problem. I mean, time after time. And just, I'm sorry, one more thing I want to say about that. If you think about how a lawyer goes about doing their case, I don't create. We're going to be going forward to a trial, right? So, okay, think of that as an election, but we're going forward to a trial. I am not going to create the theory of my case until I do all my discovery, because I'm entitled to look at the other guy's stuff. So I want to see what it is and what their arguments are and what their evidence is. And I want to completely understand where they're coming for before I sit back and decide what the theory of my case is. And even once I do that, if the theory of my case is not proving to be effective and efficient, I have to be ready to say, not easily, but I have to be ready to stop and say, is this theory working, or is there another way that I need to go about this? But that's how lawyers work, and we have the benefit of 3 years of training to have that mindset. But as you say, knowing what the other person has to say before you start really solidifying your own thinking can be really, really helpful.
Yeah, for sure. And I love that story with your wife. I love that, what can I do for you? I love that. That's a great way to sort of start in the next step of the conversation. It's interesting the adversarial nature of the trial courtroom kind of scenario. In America, we've adopted that model be out beyond the courtroom, right? That's just kind of an
Mhm.
American kind of value cultural thing that we sort of look at the world that way. Like we'll have a side A and a side B, and they'll go at it, and there'll be some adjudicating position somewhere, role
Mhm.
somewhere. I think that's part of our problem that we're suffering now is that we expect everything to sort of be like that, and there's not
Yeah,
always
yeah.
that adjudicating role, right? In the courtroom, there is, but and it's very specific to evidence and this kind of thing. In a personal relationship, that's not always really the best way to do it, and there isn't always that adjudicating role, right?
Right.
So and I think we've started to not respect some of these adjudicating, bodies that should be
Mm.
that historically, like we don't sort of trust, the administration or the government or the educational institutions and things like that, that all sort of used to be the bodies that kind of held these positions of authority. And we're definitely losing trust in a lot of that. And even in the courtrooms, I mean, we're losing trust. There's people that don't trust these judge decisions anymore. And
Mhm.
that's a real breakdown of our sort of the fundamental, some of the fundamental aspects of our society, really.
Yeah, yeah, and especially the news. But before we get away from the question of unity, I want to ask you to go back and reflect on your three types of unity. That I believe you had two misconceptions about unity and one that was more democratic.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of interviews and sort of casual, you know, research, you could say, but it's kind of it's not necessarily it's more qualified than it is quantifiable. But I get a sense from talking to this to like regular people, and it's very few people. If you say, "Do you want more unity?" I mean, and we see this in polls. So it's beyond anything that I've looked at. That people say, "Yeah, I want more unity." Like, I think I'm upset about the division. I'm upset about the sort of hostility and all this kind of thing. Almost everyone says that, right? But when you drill down on that and look at what that really means, oftentimes it sort of means the way to not have as much hostility is if those other people would just look at things the way I see it. If I could just get them to see the world in a smarter way, because they're obviously dumb and wrong and sometimes even immoral. If I can get them to see my way, then we'll have unity. That's how we think about unity. And I think we have to realize that, unity is particularly in a sort of messy democracy like we have in a democratic republic. like we have is kind of messy. Like unity means we're able to be in the room with people we don't agree with and solve things through negotiation and compromise and law and you know agreeing to those adjudicating pieces like judges and things like that, agreeing that yeah we'll abide by what this judge says and agreeing by this kind of stuff by um sort of appreciating the other person's perspective, but accepting that, sometimes we're going to have to compromise. So we're not always going to get what we want. We're going to be in a room with people that we don't even like sometimes. And I think this is what people often lose about kind of unity really means more of that. And we can maybe, what we can do is then maybe find what are these unifying values and stuff that we will all appreciate and can understand and be unified more by some of these bigger values, and figure out what those are. And then, but within that, you can have lots of policy debate and lots of policy discrepancy. Like we probably both want our kids to have good schools or something like that, right? But what does good schools mean to you? What does good
Right.
schools mean to me? Things like that. But we can have these larger things we can become unified about. Like we want, uh, you know, a, a healthy society. We just want our families. We want life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, basically, right? So we can unite around these values, but we sometimes think that means we then also must unite around all the policies, and that's not really what unity means in a messy democracy like we have. It means getting in a room and staying in a room with people you disagree with, and sometimes having to compromise. And all of that has kind of become bad words, like compromise. I'm not going to compromise anything, right? Well,
Hmm.
that's the situation we're in now, where nothing gets done. Neither side wants to compromise. Neither side wants their representatives to compromise. And so guess what? Nothing happens.
Yeah, and it's funny because uh, I'm sure that very few people want the result of not compromising. Let's say that you are a tight-fisted fiscal conservative, and I'm a la la kumbaya. We have to take care of every homeless person in the world, person, right? Um, if neither of us are compromising, we're going to wind up either completely broke or we're going to wind up with a lot of dead people. And neither of us wants those extreme examples. Um, so, how do we begin to help people realize that compromise is not such a bad word?
Right. And that because there's a lot of, this kind of, I talk about kind of the outrage industry, this kind of, there's a whole incentive structure around keeping us angry at each other, right? There's a lot of people
Hmm.
that benefit from it. I mean, all the social media engines do because that's how they're built around engagement, and they've figured out that that keeping us angry and mad at and yelling at each other all the time is how they get us to stay on those platforms, and that's how they sell us to advertisers. The same thing in traditional media is kind of the same thing, right? They want us watching the commercials and staying engaged and commenting online and all that kind of stuff. Um, and there's but also politicians, right? For politicians, this is a good. It simplifies their world. If they can mostly spend most of their energy is telling us how bad the other side is, how much we should hate the other side and be scared of them, then they don't really have to worry too much about policy. Tell us what they're going to do, right? They can all just focus on how the other side is evil and awful. And so there's a bunch of that whole incentive structure creates this whole powerful engine that keeps us looking at the world that way and seeing compromise as a death threat almost, right? As an existential threat. And so it's not easy. So it sort of starts with us because it's not going to come from the top. The elites
Hmm.
aren't going to do this for us. We're going to have to push them to do it. And then we just have to start being more accountable to ourselves and more accountable, make our representatives be more accountable to getting things done. Like instead of measuring them by how many times they show up in news clips and have a TikTok memorable moment, look at their voting record. Look at their are they sponsoring bills? Are they working across the aisle to push bills forward and to find compromise and to make things happen? We're not measuring them by that for the most part. We're measuring them by how often they show up
Hmm.
in TikToks. So a
Yeah.
lot of it is that, just it's getting us to take a more serious role in this and not be misled and be more mindful of how many sort of bad actors, if you will, are trying to manipulate us to stay angry at each other.
There, it's funny. Just the other day, I'm kind of an old Twilight Zone freak. Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, and every once in a while, I'll tune in and watch one. And the one that I saw the other day was the event on Milburn Street. I think it was Milburn Street, but it was a town, a small little town, and some weird things started happening. First, the streetlights started flickering, and then the lights would go out in everybody's house except one person's house. So other odd things were happening, and they started thinking that something was happening to us. And that there was some force at work. And as these odd, weird things that nobody could explain were happening, but they just weren't happening to this one person, they thought that that one person became the enemy. He became the other. And then they didn't know, the fear escalated and escalated. Somebody came walking down through the shadows. They finally had surmised that it was aliens who were doing this, and there was an alien invasion, and they saw a form and a figure, and somebody shot him, and turned out to be one of their neighbors. And then the scene backed up to the spaceship that was on the hill above them. And these guys were actually manipulating all of that. And then one said to the other, see, we don't have to invade them. All we have to do is make them scared of each other. And it reminds me of these brokers that you're talking about, these outrage brokers. They're the aliens on the hill, and they're just feeding us this stuff that's making us, become enemies of each other. And it's kind of scary.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's important though that to realize we do have agency. It's not like a lost cause. These are challenging problems for sure, but a lot of it is, comes back to us. We can start working together and start being more mindful of this kind of thing and start
Mm-hmm.
pushing back against it. So we want to be careful to think it's never going to change because you can fall into that. We do have some agency here. We have a lot more agency than we think we do. But it's an uphill battle for sure because there's a lot of money and power pushing us in the other direction.
So let me ask you something that's been coming up into my mind a little bit lately, just because it seems like there's an awfully close coincidence of numbers and things that I'm seeing, and kind of putting it together. Now I'm talking about extremists, and I'm not talking left right. Okay, we're not just if you look at somebody that experiences a lot of adverse childhood incidents as the experiences, as now the psychologists call them ACEs, right? People that have like 4 or more ACEs, they constitute about 17 to 21% of the population, actually, which is pretty sad, about a fifth of the population. And the way that people who experiences these lack of self, people that are embarrassed, psychological, physical abuse, and the like, they grow up tending to being black and white thinkers. They tend to be very emotional, attracted to somebody who will protect them, give them straight answers. They don't like any lack of clarity, any chaos. Their idea of stability is extremely strong, and they can be threatened. They're hypervigilant, and these are the effects of people that have experienced trauma. And if you look at some of the characteristics of the extremists on both sides of the political party, and you look at kind of the numbers and percentages, there's a lot of kind of coincidence here. I'm not saying that one is the form of the other, but I'm beginning to think that, it might be that some of the people whose behavior we just can't understand. Why do people follow a strongman who is not advocating for things that are in their best interest, that are actually hurting them? And they still follow them in cult type situations. Do you think that those those people who have experienced trauma and exhibit that kind of adult behavior may very well make up a higher percentage of the population who we call at the extremes, my way or the highway. It's got to be this way, black and white thinking type of stuff.
Yeah, and I don't know for sure if there's a lot of research, sort of backing this up. It certainly intuitively, it aligns, like you said, and I think it applies. Like I'm glad you mentioned, this is not sort of a left-right thing because
Yeah.
we always tend to try to flatten everything into sort of a left-right spectrum, and everything is a little bit more complicated than that, right? There's lots of different reasons people sort of vote they do and look at the world the way they do and the values that they have, and all those things play into it in a much more nuanced way than a simple left right spectrum.
Yeah, because
Um,
on the left, people that are, you just can't say it in that way. You can't say Oriental. You've committed a terrible crime if you say Oriental, you don't say Asian. And it's just a terrible thing. I don't even want to be your friend if you don't know the right way to talk about an Asian. That's the same thing.
right, yeah, and there's lots of versions of that kind of thing, like you said,
Hmm.
on the extremes on both sides, and there's lots of this sort of ideological purity tests and things like that
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
aren't necessarily very productive. But again, sort of trying to fall not into sort of a doomsday scenario kind of thing. But I think you're right. I have seen lots of research about folks that sort of say we need a general healing, and there's lots of trauma, and the side effects of trauma are, keep us have spill out into these other areas, including our political views and our sort of political
Hmm.
malaise. Um, but I do want to make sure we point out that rather than this, it's not a doomsday scenario though, too, because there is this majority of this sort of exhausted majority. Sometimes it's talked about, or you see a large percentage of people now declaring themselves sort of as independents because they're not comfortable with sort of the label of either tribe, the Republican tribe or the Democratic tribe, and they declare themselves as independent, even if they tend to vote, one way or the other more often. And I think all those are signs that the political tribe stuff is struggling more than they'd like to believe. And there
Hmm.
are fewer partisans that are just lockstep in line. But we get a misperception that's a lot more common than we think, because that's what kind of dominates the online space. That's what dominates a lot of these political conversations. And obviously that's what you're going to see on a partisan TV show. They're not going to bring on the, you know, moderate people with calm views, right? That's a boring
Hmm.
TV show, right? So they're always got people that are willing to take the most extreme views they're willing to say on TV. So we get a misperception that that's kind of how all the world is, and we do have to remember that there is this sort of exhausted majority. And again, it's not on a left-right spectrum of exhausted majority. It's people that are kind of, you know, all over the place with different kind of views and some heterodox kind of thinking even sometimes, but they are united around that idea that they're a little bit fed up with the very highly partisan stuff. Sometimes you'll see people talk about like the movable middle, and we sometimes think that means they're sort of mushy middle on the left right spectrum, or they're mushy middle on issue positions, but really it's just a movable middle that's more moderate in their tribal nature, I guess I'll say, or their partisan nature. So they're more movable on that front. They still can have strong convictions. They still can have, strong morals and all this kind of things, and be advocates and that kind of thing for their position. So sometimes people mistake this movable middle for some kind of a mushy center, and those aren't necessarily the same thing. But that what is often talked about as that movable middle is really where, I think that's the group that's going to start, that has the opportunity. I'm going to say that I don't know they're going to, but that's where the opportunity for countering some of this and saying we're sort of over it. We don't want this partisan messaging. We don't want this hostility. We don't want, to believe our fellow Americans are evil and immoral. That's not good for us. We don't want that. And I think that's where that's going to come from.
Well, as you say, it is not a doomsday situation, but it does require our attention, and not only our attention, but our intention to make a difference in our own thinking. Um, and I guess that's the only way to make a difference in the thinking. But we've been talking, we haven't been talking doomsday, but it has been a little bit that way. So let's end this with something uplifting and fun. And I've got something. I'll start, and then you can come up with yours. Okay.
Great.
I am so excited about all the towns around the country that have become home to the international soccer teams. I'm seeing over and over, and I'm looking for it now, but Topeka, Kansas, and other towns, they became the home base for the Algerian team. And now the whole town is wearing green, and they got the university band to learn the Algerian national anthem. So when the Algerians went out to practice on the high school football grounds, they played their national anthem, and the kids are coming down and getting lessons from them. And they've just kind of adopted this team. I saw a little clip about one of the folks who was wearing all green. He was asked what he knows about Algiers, and he said, well, I think they're on the Mediterranean, or maybe it's the Sahara. Well, I don't know, but I'm so happy they're here. And, that's the America that I've always loved. So, we still, right out there on the ground, we're still just a great, loving, welcoming people. We make the best of it. Okay, that's mine.
Yeah, I mean, that's fantastic. And you're right. I mean, that's such a great counter narrative to this idea that there's a bunch of people that hate immigrants or hate foreigners and all this kind of stuff. And that's a fringe view, right? Like that's not, and it's so, as you say, it's so American to be welcoming and friendly to these visitors that come here and to try to put on the best face for them, to give them the best version of America we have, that kind of thing. That's like things we can unite around. And even, there's a lot of people think, oh, Republicans don't like immigrants of any kind. And that's not actually true. Like when you look at the stats on that, Republicans and Democrats are about the same in their warmth. It's kind of a warmth measure toward legal immigrants. It's about the same. But there's a big difference between what they consider illegal immigrants. But in terms of, legal immigrants, they have about the same warmth towards them. So it's a misperception to think all Republicans sort of hate immigrants or something like that. So we easily can get fed that story, right? That narrative. But I think those are great counter narrative stories to that kind of thing. That's such an American value, like you say, to share. I do love that. I don't know. For me, I think some of the just meat and potatoes aspect of some of the work that I'm doing is some of the positive things that I have. I do love those kind of stories though, and I think that's something we have to get much better at, is sort of telling stories rather than sort of reading stats like I just did. We have to tell stories, but yeah, we have to get better at that. But yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned before, I think it was Ground News. There's some other things like that. There's a search engine because the information world is a challenge. Like there's no magic answer to get good information. There's people always want, like, give me the one source I can go to that's always accurate and reliable and balanced. And it's like, yep, that doesn't really exist. So it's a heavy lift. I'm not going to pretend it's not a heavy lift to get good information. But there's a search engine called FreeSpoke. It's kind of their version of Google, that for political queries, it does something like what you're talking about with Ground, where it shows, the article breakdown on the left and the right and the center maybe, and with the percentage, and then and gives you some back, and they give their own analysis. They try to be nonpartisan analysis on it. So that's one tool for looking at the political conversation. And I think in the information sphere, there's also a newsletter you can subscribe to called 1440 News. Comes to you in email, and it kind of has a daily recap of, I don't know, 20 or more stories. But the sources that they reference are usually more reasonable. So you could easily, I've seen newsletters that create the most extreme news stories of the day from each side. And that just riles us all up, because the headlines are sensational, the whole thing. 1440 does a pretty good job to pull out stories that are more reasonable, do a little bit of their own breakdown. So you can get a rough idea of what's going on in the news each day. And when you do click through and go to the link, it'll typically be a more reasonable story that they've kind of vetted. And that was human vetted. That's not using AI or algorithms. They have a human team that vets those stories. So I won't go into a whole lot, because there's other ones I could reference, but those are a couple. Like if you're looking for a little bit more calmness in your news diet and a little bit more reasonableness, not, because it's easy to fall into being so angry because you go look at the headlines that the other side is putting out, and it'll just drive you crazy, and vice versa, right? And you don't see it so much when your side's doing it because it sounds reasonable. Yeah, that person is terrible. I agree with that. But if you were on the other side and saw that, it would be very, very, you would not like it. So anyway,
Yeah, although I will say that it is helpful to look at the extreme stuff of the other side, whichever other side it is, just so that you have a little knowledge base of what the knowledge is that they're getting, so that you're a little bit prepared. Like there's this one newsletter called The Writing, which is RIGHTING,
yeah.
and it just lists the headlines of the most extreme right-wing things. And I look at it every once in a while because I really want to know what it is that's feeding. It helps me to be maybe a little bit more compassionate. It helps me to be a little bit more understanding of the other side, knowing, well, yeah, if that's the diet of stuff that I was getting, I would be just like that. And if you understand that about somebody, it's not that they are a bad person, or that they are evil or the like. It's just that they, have, if you feed somebody a steady diet of carrots, at least you think they're going to have good vision. But they might not have any muscle mass. If you just see what their steady diet is, it's just helpful to understand a little bit if you do it for that purpose, but not if you do it just to make yourself mad.
Well, and that goes back to that word you used before of intentionality, right? I mean, some of this is going in with sort of a clear intention, and also, I call it sort of inoculating myself sometimes. If I'm going to go read a partisan side, even if it's my side, what I think is my side, the partisan side, go in with that view that they are going to try to rile me up, right? That'll help you detect it when it's happening and maybe not react to it as much, because they are going to try to rile you up. On either side. I would say, I would add, if you're going to look at something like The Writing, I would add, maybe balance that a little bit with something like The Flip Side. That's another newsletter that comes out irregularly. I don't think it's daily. And they do a collection of, what the left is saying, what the right is saying on a few topics. And again, it'll typically be a little bit more reasoned right, or the more reasoned left. So you won't get the sort of wild sort of view that kind of, you can get a misperception that the left only has crazy views or the right only has crazy views. And
Yeah.
another one, another one called Tangle does that as well.
Yeah. No, I don't mean that you for that reason, but a lot of people are reading those things.
Right.
So I think it's an important data point that that this is the stuff that a lot of
That's
people are reading.
why they think you're crazy, basically, right?
That's why they think I'm crazy, right?
So you get some explanation. I can see why you think I'm crazy if these are the headlines you're getting. Yeah.
That you're reading. Yeah. Yeah, it's a complicated thing, David. Thank you so much. Outrage Overload is David's podcast, and you also have a blog on Substack. I know a lot of you guys are on Substack, so look up. Was it under your name or is it under Outrage Overload?
It's under Outrage Overload, yeah.
Okay,
and you can get to it from outrageoverload.net. Yeah.
Yeah, look at outrageoverload.net. So, check it out and read, because having a steady diet of things that help you to look at your steady diet is a good diet. And
awesome.
Thank you for that. And thank you for the work that you do. I told you early on before we started that I was going to call you an angel, and I didn't do it yet. So I'm going to do it now. David, you are an angel. From a Buddhist, in Buddhism, we would say you are a bodhisattva. And I will tell you what a bodhisattva is. A bodhisattva is a person who chooses not to cross over into nirvana, but to stay in the chaos just for the purpose of helping others cross over.
I like that.
What an act of generosity and grace that would be.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And as you know, we all love to get feedback. So I answer every email I get. So anybody that has any questions or thoughts or wants to give ideas of what we should talk about, always reach out.
And they can contact you through the .net?
Yeah. Yep,
All
all my
right.
contact is on there.
Thanks so much.